Hi, Mark.
Hi, Reihan. How are you?
Not bad.
Good.
I'm Reihan Salam with The Atlantic and the New America Foundation, and I'm here with Mark Schmitt.
And I am also of the New America Foundation, but not for long, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But first, I want to congratulate you, Reihan, for your big day. Your book with Ross Douthat has now finally appeared after months of being talked about, and you got some wonderful comments from David Brooks today. I got in the Times. I got an email from a very liberal economist friend of mine who said, this Douthat Salam book, should I just go out and read it? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like they've got some great ideas. So,
well, thank you very much, Mark. I really appreciate it. David is really someone who's very important to me and someone I really respect and admire tremendously, and it really was a tremendous honor. And working with Ross has also been really cool. But I also hear that there is some wonderful news for the American left that perhaps counteracts any positive news for the American right, which is that one of the greatest intellects of our time is now going to take the helm of one of the most important progressive institutions of our time. Can you tell us more about that?
I didn't hype my congratulations to you quite as much. Yeah, I'm going to become the executive editor of the American Prospect. So hopefully my attribution on blogging heads in the future won't just say Decemberist, the blog I haven't actually maintained in a while, but maybe we'll be able to say the American Prospect, where I've been writing a column for a couple of years, and I'm just thrilled to become the editor. I'm kind of amazed to become the editor of it. I've never been the editor of a magazine before, and as I think you know, Reihan, it's a fabulous staff at the moment, and really dedicated, and just tremendous potential. I mean, I think the great thing about it, from my point of view, is that in the year ahead, the year after that, the first few years of a new administration, just a perfect moment for a magazine like that, that captures both the politics and the policy, where they come together to kind of shape the future. So I just think it's a great moment to do it. Somebody said to me, Steve Call, the president of New America, said to me when I told him, his first reaction was, well, it's the Weekly Standard moment. That is, it's exactly comparable to the moment that the Weekly Standard had when it kind of came onto the scene around the same time as the big Republican majorities in the 1990s. So I hope that's true.
Oh, wow. I thought you were sort of suggesting that you guys were going to lead us into some sort of a massive foreign policy debacle of some kind.
Well,
the Prospect would agitate for the invasion of, Uzbekistan, perhaps. Although I would probably be for it under the right circumstances. I'm not going to lie to you.
Right, that is right. I used that analogy to somebody else, and they're like, "Well, that's a terrible. What about the Weekly Standard? Horrible analogy."
I'm a big fan of the Weekly Standard. So
yes, don't follow their advice about what countries to invade. But other than that, there's interesting stuff in the magazine. They're great. It's always, I think there's always a lot of place for that kind of magazine that's both a touchstone for people in the movement, but also gives people some room to write and to write expressively. And people at the Standard like Chris Caldwell. I just think it's really important to have those kinds of outlets that help people think. We often think of these things as like promotional vehicles, like here's our thing, we use this magazine or whatever to promote it. That what they actually, and sometimes they're that, but sometimes they're also just a space where kind of debates and discussion can happen, or people can test out an idea, and maybe it's a bad idea, but maybe it's a subject of debate. And I think that's I hadn't really thought. I've gotten a few questions today about what are your visions for the Prospect, and I think part of it is to make sure it is fully a place of debate, rather than not a place that has a single point of view, but a place where there's a good range of points of view. And of course,
so you're not planning on enforcing Schmittianism.
What's that?
You're not planning on enforcing Schmittianism.
There's no doctrine of Schmittianism, neither Carl Schmitt nor Mark Schmitt. That will be enforced in the
Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy is going to be republished. That would be very scary.
Yeah, I think it would be very, very dangerous.
It's interesting. I mean, the Weekly Standard actually has been incredibly generous to me, and also to Ross and I in our kind of mutual shared projects. And I think that they've actually been very open to lots of heterodox ideas. And I feel like the Prospect too, just when I think about friends of mine who've worked there over the years and the range of new ideas they've introduced, I mean, I think it just is an institution with tremendous potential. And I think that it's the perfect marriage. Yeah, boy. I mean, I think this is the great news for today.
Good. Well, thank you, Reihan. I appreciate having your your goodwill, and how's your day going? How's your book publicity?
It's very
going?
interesting because it's different. I mean, I think that blogging heads is really neat because one gets to be very discursive and one gets to go really deep into the weeds. We have an audience that is just very receptive to that kind of thing.
Right.
And I think that, doing other kinds of media, it's definitely different. I mean, pretty neat, and it's also, like, really good to learn how to do that stuff.
Right.
But another...
So what are you doing? You're doing that thing?
Head.
You're doing that thing where, like, you sit in a hotel room and different reporters come in and get 5 minutes of your time and then act like they know you.
Although I remember that was featured in Notting Hill, and then there was Hugh Grant pretended to be from Horse and Hound magazine, and I actually wanted to also announce that while Mark Schmitt is becoming the editor of a prominent progressive publication, I am actually going to be joining Horse and Hound as a roving correspondent who's focusing mainly on horses. Actually, I'm very afraid of animals. There was a dog yapping at me the other day, and it was very furry and fluffy, and I was just totally terrified.
That's the scariest kind.
This has been like one of the most amazing weeks in American politics, partly because you see Barack Obama transitioning to a general election strategy, and you see this. I mean, he's someone who is a legal academic, someone who has very extensive understanding of constitutional jurisprudence, taking some actually fairly surprising, or what look from the outside like surprising positions on the recent Supreme Court docket. I know that neither of us are lawyers, but I mean I know that you, as a kind of wide-ranging fellow, have some thoughts on this, and I was just wondering, what do you make of Obama's positioning? Is this some kind of Sister Souljah style, kind of bobbing and weaving, or is there something else going on here?
Well, I think what are the ones that surprised you most particularly? His statement on the child rape ruling.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
And also
that one in particular, and
gun rights,
and the DC gun rights. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, both of those are the two classic issues on which I think. First of all, neither of them is an easy constitution. Neither of them is an easy call. As a legal liberal, I don't see either of those as cases where I think the court either got it absolutely right or absolutely wrong. And the other one I want to talk about is the Millionaire Amendment case on campaign finance reform.
Oh yeah, of course.
Although falls in a different category. Gun control and death penalty are the two areas that, at different points in the last few years, Democrats, liberals have learned they're just sort of limits to where you can stand. And I'm strongly against the death penalty, and I'm particularly strongly against the death penalty because of the fact that we have executed innocent people, and there's really very little doubt about that, given the kind of representation that people receive. So you could say, in some theoretical sense, there are crimes that are so heinous that they deserve the death penalty. We don't actually have a system that we can rely on well enough to determine whether people actually committed those crimes or not. But as for drawing the distinction, for some people it seems obvious that murder is a capital crime and everything else isn't, and if you cross that line to treating rape as a capital crime, there's some line that's been crossed. I'm not sure I see it as that obvious. And Obama, it's interesting, Obama's position on that was, he actually went back some time ago that he'd taken a position. I don't know if it's a quote from one of the books or a quote from earlier that I've seen, that he'd taken that position that rape of a child should be seen as a heinous crime, which is quite interesting, given that he also was very active in Illinois in a set of reforms that fixed some of the really egregious errors in their administration of the death penalty. That was that's one of the states where a distinct group of people were exonerated off death row at one point, as new evidence became available, and he was really a leader in correcting that. So you just don't want to go into an election with this, opposes death penalty for child rapists and having to defend that and having to argue about that. And it's also not. I'm not sure it's an easy call. As long as you're not, it'd be great if Democratic politicians were willing to be like Tim Kaine, and basically oppose the death penalty on general principle. Very few since Dukakis have. And so so it is. And then the gun right. We'll go back to you, and then maybe talk about the gun rights case and the other cases.
Well, I think it's it's very interesting to me. I know that Charles Krauthammer has referred to him as the ever malleable Obama, and you noted that actually he's had a pretty consistent position on this issue for a long time. And really, I wonder about. I mean, none of us can really dig deep down inside someone's head. I mean, I know that, Matt Welch has done a lot of fascinating work trying to dig into, what McCain really believes, and a number of people tried to figure out where, Barack Obama really is on free trade. Our mutual friend Matt Iglesias, for example, was dismissing a lot of, free trade, pro-trade, liberals and conservatives who believe that, Obama might speak protectionist language and really can believe something else. And, Matt said very soundly, look, I mean, he's had this position pretty consistently through his political career, so, you might expect that he's going to take this position, he's going to be consistent about this position going forward. But then, of course, in his interview with Nina Easton, he talked about how one amplifies things at times in the campaign. It was actually very earnest, and I'm not inclined to attack him for it. I mean, I think that it's something that is true, but it does suggest that the Sebastian Malabys of the world, who suggested that Obama, in fact, doesn't necessarily believe some of the rhetoric he shared on the campaign trail. It is very thorny, and I remember thinking this, when I was a pro-Jerry Brown, left-winger, in 1992. I was 12.
Well, I didn't know this bit of your history.
Yeah, I mean, I was...
You need to be held accountable for these kinds of things.
Yeah, no, I absolutely should. In fact, I should be, slapped. But actually, I still admire Jerry Brown, but that's a whole separate issue. Governor Moonbeam, my favorite governor to be. But he... it just seemed, I mean, do you really, the whole, bit about executing a gentleman who was mentally retarded, I mean, do people really believe that Bill Clinton thought that was the right thing? Maybe he did. But, I mean, I am a supporter of the death penalty. I believe that it should be radically narrowed in scope. I think that there should be an incredibly high burden. And I'm not someone who's enthusiastic about it. In fact, when I was in college, I took part in anti-death penalty protests. And, I mean, I've been at different places on this particular issue, as I have on, many issues. But... I agree with Obama's position on this particular issue, but I do wonder because, certainly, I have this desire to project a kind of sociological framework, which, I should be suspicious of and I shouldn't want to do. But it certainly seems to me that Obama would, believe very deeply in a kind of human rights-oriented legal liberalism of the kind you describe. And so it was interesting to me. But again, as you say, I mean, part of the role of a Democratic politician is to reflect a constituency. And
right.
I think that there's a kind of, there's a discourse, there's a conflict and a tension. And I think it's interesting the way that, we value authenticity and integrity above politicians who really do map onto the preferences and values of voters a lot of the time, which is, a little strange. So I think that, people talk about pandering, but, one of my favorite books is this book, Politicians Don't Pander, making the point that actually people use crafted language to, try to make their ideology, fit, the square peg of that into the round hole of public opinion as it really exists. And I don't really know what to think. I mean,
Well, I'm a big critic of the whole idea of the whole framework that tries to look for what's the authentic thing and then what's the thing that they say to get elected. I just don't think that's the right way to look at most things, not all things.
There's a discourse. I mean, there's an exchange.
Right. I mean, you look at something like free trade. I mean, a lot of people are very, they see any somebody says something like, a lot of people have really been hurt by NAFTA, and in future trade agreements, we really need to have, more rigorous labor and environmental agreements. That seems like a sound statement to me. A lot of people hear that, particularly through the framework of old arguments that happened, 15 years ago, and they go, that sounds like terrible protectionism, and yet it's a perfectly reasonable. Both things can be true. You can generally think that to the extent we want to have free trade, we should. But trade is a fairly nobody has a deep-seated ideology. The only people who have deep-seated ideologies about trade are a certain set of the kind of the plutocrats of people who that's their view of the economy. Most everybody else has
and libertarians, and also there's a certain kind of humanist sensibility.
Right. And there may be an isolationist extreme, but most people are trying to work out something practical. What's kind of the best compromise here? People do have deep-seated gut feelings about death penalty, but they're also. I mean, I've never been a politician, but my views about the salience of it have varied over time. There are times when I've sort of felt like, what? It's kind of what the American people want. It's kind of what the people in most states, in a lot of states, want. what's the point of really? Which is similar to my view about guns. I mean, in my completely ideal paradise world, there'd be no guns and no death penalty. But in the real world, you do have to accept things that people have strong feelings about. I always had more. I always felt like it was more outrageous when I lived in New York. It was more outrageous to have Pataki. It was like what motivated me to vote against Pataki was death penalty, because I don't think New York should have death penalty. If I lived in Texas, I probably wouldn't worry about death. It's just a given. Texas is going to have a death penalty.
It's interesting, just with regard to what you were saying about trade. I mean, I do think that it's interesting. There is an interesting space to talk about what free trade means. The things that we call free trade agreements, I mean, a lot of very articulate, self-described free traders, Jagdish Bhagwati, Arvind Panagaria, I mean, these are guys who are actually very critical of them. They call them preferential trade agreements.
Sure.
It's sort of because, I mean, they, could theoretically undermine multilateral free trade. And then there's also the argument that, it's a case for national security, or, there's some other reason to actually deepen relations with particular countries. I mean, there are a lot of interesting issues and a lot of surprising, quirky positions. Then there's also the fact that the United States often seems to impose rules that have nothing to do with free trade, relating to copyright and what have you. So, I mean, I think that actually there is an interesting discussion to be had, but, I mean... So I see your point about the authenticity problem, but again, we try to deploy that as a cudgel against our political opponents.
Well, that's all it is, right.
For example, I mean, I think that
I don't believe it.
liberals are very happy to deploy it as a cudgel against conservatives. You're a kind of civilized fellow. Surely you don't believe X, Y, and Z. These fever swamp beliefs. Yet you say this. I mean, and I think that the same thing happens from the right directed against the left. I do think there is a principled position that says, look, we think that these things should be settled through kind of steady accommodation and through, kind of actually some kind of shift in popular consensus. The thing to me that really bothers me about, I don't want to use a kind of, buzzword like activism, but, certainly, when the Supreme Court and the courts, more broadly try to undermine the authority of legislatures, and when this is why I actually have a problem with the U.S. Constitution, period, by the way, because
bring it on.
I think the D.C. gun rights case was decided correctly, in my view. That
was or wasn't? I'm sorry.
Was. But I also believe that the District of Columbia should, in my perfect world, have the right to pass whatever crazy laws they want. And so, I mean, I think that that's why I was John Hart Ely and this whole idea of a constitution that's oriented toward giving very kind of broad ambit to democratically elected legislatures, but that tries to prevent entrenchment. To the extent you're going to have judicial review at all, it should be designed to see to it that sort of the political powers that be aren't trying to keep themselves in power, by gaming the system. So I think that I think that there is actually an honest framework that you can use that is pretty consistent, that says that, look, I'm not going to, sort of impose my judgment, and actually my judgment ultimately isn't what matters. What matters is this democratic conversation that happens among the rights-bearing, individuals in this country. So that, and that's not the kind of thing you're likely to hear that, the Constitution is, flawed and that we shouldn't worship it.
It is very hard. It is very hard constitutionally if you, unless you hold the view. And I've read. I'm not a scholar. I've read the different arguments at great length about the origins, about how you, about the actual meaning of the Second Amendment, and I think they're different views, but it's hard to get away from the. It really depends on how you attach those two clauses. The militia and the right to bear arms. And there's no perfect answer to that. But unless you think it's entirely dependent on the militia, if you think that Second Amendment has any meaning at all in that second clause, I'm probably going to get in trouble for this from, probably get massive comments from law professors, as we should. But if you think that second clause has real meaning, I like the Ely argument. I think that's that's a very important book and a very important argument. And you want to say, look, geez, the District of Columbia, massive support for the gun ban. It serves a huge public purpose. This is not a place where there's a lot of people who want to be hunting or anything else. I mean, there's every argument for deference to democracy is to uphold the gun ban. However, it's really hard to figure out how you're going to separate the Second Amendment from a similar case that would violate the First Amendment. In D.C. I mean, why would you? Basically, to find that way, you really do have to place a lower value on those Second Amendment rights than you would on First Amendment rights, and that is a problem. That's a problem in the Constitution, I think. I mean, you're right. And it's not like a cosmic problem with the Constitution, but they didn't give us a guideline for how you weight those things.
No, and by its nature, I mean, given the circumstances they faced, it's amazing to me how relevant and how, kind of powerfully useful those frameworks have been, mm-hmm. but also how, a lot of the dysfunctions of our democracy can be traced to the way that our constitutional order doesn't necessarily fit, the kind of metropolitan society that we live in today.
Right.
It's interesting because, actually, like, on the substantive issue, I actually think that this will be better for the district. I mean, I have all kinds of kooky views, but, like Matt Iglesias, I'm a sort of, urbanite who is, moderately pro-gun. In my perfect world, again, we would have a different mix of gun laws. My views on this are actually so bizarre that I'm reluctant to actually share
this
them.
Sounds a little dangerous. I can imagine now how you don't live in one of the house full of bloggers, do you?
No, I'm not.
I can imagine the different, Matt's house. I can imagine the different gangs of bloggers taking up arms and, having this kind of West Side Story type showdown over on U Street or something like that. I'm a little worried about that.
I can imagine them having a shootout.
Pro-gun,
really scary.
Pro-gun urbanites. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't matter. In a sense, it doesn't really matter whether you're pro-gun or anti-gun. I mean, this is this is the view of the people in D.C. and either it violates the Constitution or it doesn't.
I actually do want to mention one quick thing about that. I mean, this is a subject of particular interest to me. I'm in my hometown right now, and it's interesting the dysfunctions of urban politics because
which is your hometown for our viewers?
Actually, my hometown is Brooklyn, but I am in New York right now, so I'm near my hometown. Yeah. I think that.
Shout out to Brooklyn.
The use of right on the imposition of these kind of partisan frameworks, the fact that we have partisan elections in big cities. David Schleicher wrote this really interesting law review paper on how this is really problematic because basically in cities you have people voting strict party line votes, yet who's actually controlling access to the nominating process at that point? You don't really have competitive elections as a result. So actually you say that rightly say that it looks like the citizens of the District of Columbia support these gun laws, but actually is the district a really good example of deliberative democracy at work? I mean, does it have a kind of flourishing and competitive political system, the kind that we'd like to see? I mean, these are all kind of kooky normative questions, but I often wonder about that. And if you had a kind of more competitive environment where instead of having, say, the Democrats squaring off against the virtually non-existent District of Columbia Republicans, if you had D.C. statehood versus the D.C. Greens versus the Social Democrats, etc., or some other parties that are oriented particularly toward the needs and interests of the district's communities, would we have a more flourishing politics? This is one reason why I'm a big believer in the use of proportional representation at the municipal level. But again, this is taking us kind of far afield. But Mark, there's also been a lot of developments on the campaign finance front, and this is an area of particular interest to you, where you've made a lot of strides in the national debate. And I'd love to hear what you think about this Millionaires Amendment case.
I've been trying. Well, the Millionaires Amendment case was the case decided yesterday, which I actually didn't read until about 10 minutes ago, and didn't get quite to the end of it even 10 minutes ago. But I've kind of opined on this before. This is a provision that was added to McCain-Feingold that said if you're running for office and your opponent spends a certain amount of his or her own funds, you're allowed to collect, instead of contributions that are limited to $2,300, you could collect double that or triple that, depending how much of his or her own money the opponent spends. And this was overturned by the Supreme Court. It was viewed very quickly, and based on language in the decision, it's correctly viewed as another nail in the coffin of campaign finance regulation, along with the Wisconsin Right to Life case, which limited a provision of McCain-Feingold on TV advertising that mentioned a candidate, which I also think was unconstitutional, is viewed as another nail in the coffin. Personally, I think the Millionaires Amendment is disgraceful, because it really, with a couple exceptions, and we'll say one of those exceptions in a minute, with a couple exceptions where that really kicks in is somebody's an incumbent, a millionaire comes along to run against them, which is often the only challenger there is for an incumbent. I mean, incumbents routinely raise, $5-7 million without lifting a finger. I mean, they lift a finger, they go to fundraisers, but they don't have to do it, make any particular effort to do it. Because the lobbyist money just comes right to them. Almost the only kind of person who can compete with a Denny Hastert, let's say in the last cycle, who I think had $7 million for a seat he then resigned from. The only kind of person who can be a good challenger is usually a self-funded candidate. There aren't too many people who are able, like Obama, to go out and get a lot of money in small contributions. This provision would basically say that incumbent who's already getting $7 million from the lobbyists can now take, instead of taking $2,300 from each lobbyist, they can take $4,600, or they can take $6,900.
What do you think of the McDonald's
that goes up?
Idea?
We'll get back to the.
Oh yeah.
I think it's too constrained. I like open systems. I like open and flexible systems. So the Millionaire Amendment is to me an outrage. I mean, one candidate who was elected by the Millionaire Amendment was Senator Lieberman because Ned Lamont spent some of his own money. So Lieberman, gets this massive flush of money from lobbyists and Wall Street, and fends off the Lamont challenge. Now, if we think that we have the only way we regulate campaign finance is on the basis of corruption. We think large contributions are corrupting. So we say 2,300, beyond 2,300 is potentially corrupting. And, obviously there are ways to double that and things like for the primary and the general, things like that. But we say it's beyond that, anything more than that is corrupting. And then we say, well, in this one special case, maybe it's not corrupting. Maybe you should be able to collect more. But we don't say anything about that, that ordinary challenger who's trying to run against a Hastert or somebody like that who has gazillions of dollars from lobbyists, gets none of that benefit. So to me it was a completely obvious bit of incumbent protection. It was, by the way, a provision of McCain-Feingold that was supported. It was proposed by Senator Domenici, supported by all Republicans, opposed by a majority of Democrats. Although some Democrats supported it, it was not supported by campaign finance reformers, and I don't think it should be treated as. I don't think it's being overturned by the court should be treated as a defeat for campaign finance reform. What the decision makes harder, though, is provisions that would say, there could be variable things, either contribution limits or flexible spending limits or things like that, as part of a campaign finance system. As part of a public financing system. So in New York City, for example, where they have this 4-to-1 match, or now it's a 6-to-1 match on small contributions, if somebody doesn't participate in that system, which has limits in it, somebody comes in whether it's like Bloomberg, or somebody not like Bloomberg spending a lot of money from contributors, the other candidate is able to raise more and spend more while they're still participating in the system. I mean, in other words, you got to have some of these variable things, not the Millionaire's Amendment per se, but variable things like that. And in California, they used to talk about like a overall varying contribution limits. That's a pretty good innovation, and the decision, in some ways, makes it sound like the court's going to be pretty skeptical of any system like that, not just one that's focused on self-financed opponents, and that's a really dangerous. That closes off a lot of really great opportunities for campaign finance reform. So I wish they just wiped out the amendment. That'd be great. But we're definitely moving down danger. We're definitely moving into an area where it's getting close to a free-for-all on campaign finance reform. And maybe we just learn to live with that.
Interesting. So you say just learn to live with that. I mean, it seems that you sound like not too despairing about that. Do you feel like you can imagine, kind of a return to laissez-faire in campaign finance that would actually work pretty well for Democrats and progressives?
I would like to move toward. See, what I've always pushed is get rid of the limits approach to campaign finance reform. Get out of the head that where you think of money's bad. Put a lid on it, put a lid on it, put a lid on it. You see it going somewhere else, put another lid on it. Constantly chasing down loopholes. I prefer an approach that says, and I think what Obama's been able to do, which represents not just what Obama's been able to do, but what's possible with the internet. How how it's possible to actually build a fundraising base in constituencies and issues that were never part of the conversation before, how things are possible, and instead give those things a boost. Do the matching system, do other kinds of public financing, facilitate those things, and get to the point where you think of campaign finance reform. I think we're at the point now, because of the internet, because of what some candidates have shown is possible. I think we can begin to think seriously about what the ACLU used to call floors without ceilings for campaign finance. That is, a set of public policies that actually ensure that good candidates with a base of support reach that threshold where they can be heard, where they can compete and be heard, and not worry about somebody else, spending $10, $12 million or for a congressional seat, let's say, or more than that, because there are diminishing returns to spending, and we know that very, very well. And especially as there are also other ways of communicating with voters, including the internet and a kind of revived culture of organizing and grassroots organizing, rather than the way we used to do it 10 years ago or so, where everything's just dumped onto TV ads that are targeted at this narrow slice of the population that is both going to vote and basically pretty uninformed. So that they're sitting in front of the TV and the ad comes on and says, Congressman so-and-so has mafia connections and will raise your taxes, and you just sort of sit there dumbly and say, ooh, and then you go and vote against him. That's there's just fewer and fewer people who are approaching politics that way, both unengaged and voting.
I recall that you're also not a big fan of Ian Ayer's idea of the blind donation booth.
I mean,
it was a pretty attractive idea.
It's one of those great thought experiments. I just always thought it was really funny to think about the idea. People, politicians know very well who their voters are. For example, they definitely know who their contributors are. So I always thought the idea that it's the in that idea, and this would just to explain it a little further, it's the idea that rather than have full disclosure of who your contributors are, you actually go in the other direction, and all contributions actually have to be anonymous, so that the member of Congress sitting there actually doesn't know whether somebody's a donor to him or not. Which is clever, but you know pretty well that when, let's say, you're Senator John Cornyn of Texas, Big Bad John, to take his the ad that he ran this week, and some bunch of Texas oil men come in and there's an element of Ian Ayer's idea too, which is like that there's almost a virtue in lying. So like to go in and lie and say, hey, we're a huge contributor. And the politician doesn't really know and has to take you seriously either way. Well, let's say you're Senator Cornyn and a bunch of Texas oil men come in and say, Senator, we raised $4 million for your campaign. He probably knows that's true, and the delegation of welfare moms from Acorns comes in and says, Senator, we raised $4 million for your campaign. He probably knows that's not true, and he's probably right. So I just think it's one of those philosophy mind experiments. It's just it's a blast. In the real world, people do know who their contributors are, and they treat the class of their contributors. I think it's also a misconception about how these relationships work. It's not always specifically that Joe gave me $3 million. Joe raised $3 million. He's getting better treatment than Sam, who raised $5,000 for me. There's a class of people who are your type of people, who are responsible for your political success, who are your crew, and everybody in that class is treated pretty well, and everybody in another class typically is not treated as well.
It's funny you say that, because actually that's exactly the reason why I think the blind donation booth idea is actually a pretty good one. And again, you know this area much, much better than I do. But my sense is that having that plausible deniability, makes a big difference, because I actually agree. I think that if you're a timber interest, if you, are a defense contractor, you're going to get access pretty much no matter what, because, when you are responsible for a lot of employment in a congressional district, something like that.
That's very true.
I mean, that is something that's going to matter. pretty much, whoever is in office. I mean, it could be a Democrat, could be a Republican. So I think that it would actually have interesting effects, because what would happen is that donors, would, I think, tilt towards, making donations based on ideological inclinations. That's not to say that his proposal is flawless, and I can imagine that there is some way, as you say, to kind of strengthen the relative influence of lower income voters, through these matching programs that you talk about. I don't think that those are necessarily bad ideas. I think they're certainly worthy of exploration. But I think that the idea of plausible deniability is just important, because I think that, one, of these ideas that's afoot is this idea that, congressmen have to spend so much time chasing after dollars, and that's simply an actual problem in terms of the shape of their day and their ability to do their jobs well. Another reason why you look at how term limits have worked at the state level. I mean, it's been a generally pretty bad thing, or in the New York City Council, it's been a really bad thing, because you don't have people who have the kind of expertise they need to do their jobs well. It's also the gutting of congressional staffs to some extent, and I think that when you look at the Republican Party, for example, and the Democratic Party to some extent as well, if you look at the decay of policy apparatus, and the fact that they depend to such a great extent on these private sector policy shops that of course are very interested parties that sort of don't survey a broad range of expertise. I think that, the idea of having, I'm not like, sort of a member of the cult of deliberative politics, but I do think the idea of like simply aiding with the time management of a legislator, given that legislating is an actual job, it's an actual set of skills that one develops over time. And so, actually the kind of chasing after, bundlers and, kind of money in these, kind of smallish increments is something that actually, does impact the day. Now, this is very small bore. It's not something that's going to, transform the face of American democracy, but it does matter, I think, to some extent.
I think it matters. I think it's a little bit of an outdated concern. Number one, more importantly, I don't think that the blind donation booth changes that. I mean, the guy is still going to the room and calling all the people and trying to raise money. The problem is going to be that now half of them are going to lie and say they're sending money and not. So in theory, you may have to call twice as many people to get the same. To get the same $100,000.
You know this better than I do. I'm not sure that's true. In fact, I tend to think that, but it's an open question. And actually, what I would love to see is some experimentation. I mean, this is, kind of one place where I part company with a lot of folks. I mean, in fact, it's actually interesting because I remember hearing an anecdote, and, a couple of weeks ago about Arnold Schwarzenegger, kind of getting really upset when a policy scholar suggested, well, let's run an experiment to do X or Y. And he said, I don't want data, I want action, and then banging a table. And getting really, really mad. And it's interesting because I actually want data. I don't necessarily. I'm kind of happy to kind of pursue lots of different little actions. But I think that similarly, kind of reasoning our way out of this box about kind of what kind of effect it would have seems to me like not necessarily the best approach, because presumably the kind of set of interactions and as to sort of what you said before about this being a dated concern, I'll bet it is. But again, sort of at the margin, I think that it could theoretically make a difference. So you're right. If you're spending twice as much time, that's clearly bad, and if you're spending half as much time, that could be, in a very small, modest way, good.
Let me make the case against experimentation in two ways, and I don't want to be, anti-scientific, but there are two problems with experimentation. One, the same thing, and I've seen actually, there are things that go on that could be treated as experiments, but nobody actually studies them. So, folks I know, suddenly Ohio, for years, it had a tax credit system for campaign contributions, but nobody paid any attention or figured out why people didn't participate. And then some folks went in and they actually did some, real controlled experiments and sent some people a mailer saying, did you know you could do this? And some people, comparable group didn't get the mailer, and they tested the results and all that stuff, and some other things like that. But the bottom line is, the 50 states of our country and the District of Columbia and the different cities and so forth all have very distinct and different political cultures, and political culture really matters. So
I totally agree.
Things work. I got these things, and I'm always saying, look at Maine, everything works so great, and look at Minnesota, and everything works so great. But things that work in those states don't necessarily work in other states.
Or you look at Denmark, and everything works so good.
Yeah, right.
If you look at Holland,
exactly.
and everything works so good.
Exactly.
No, trust me, I agree with that wholeheartedly, and actually, I think of that as actually bolstering the case for experimentation rather than undermining the case for experimentation.
You just try it in tougher places. But the other thing is that I do think we're in the middle of a set of trends that mean that something that either a problem you wanted to solve 5 years ago, which 5 years ago there was no Barack Obama people just throwing money at you for ordinary ideological reasons. That did not exist. That's not the world that Bill Clinton raised money in 1996, for example. That was a world where you needed to find rich people. They needed a night in the Lincoln bedroom. They needed a thing before they would open their wallet. There were no small donors. There's a set of things happening that are happening faster. There were conservative small donors. Yeah. There's a set of things happening on both sides and in the middle faster than any experiment. So you could experiment with something in 2008, and by 2010 you might find that either the problem you were trying to solve had transmuted, or the solution was no longer working. So I'm not categorically against experimentation. I just think that that's that more important is to catch the trends and see what's a positive trend that you can kind of ride on. I want to go back to the court for a second.
Sure.
We start off with these three decisions. I just want to go back to something that's interesting to me, and maybe we'll just close off and talk about the what a more progressive court might look. What are the options for somebody like for President Obama? The really interesting thing about these decisions this week were that it's so plain right now that there's 4 votes here and 4 votes here and Justice Kennedy, and I just think it's very different from, and I don't have the history to say was there a moment that was similar. I mean, obviously Justice O'Connor was the swing vote in the past, but Kennedy was also kind of a swing vote. Rehnquist could be a swing vote on certain issues, on the campaign finance issues, for example. Rehnquist, because he actually didn't give 2 hoots about the First Amendment, was a very flexible vote. So you had configurations that could line up either way. Now it seems amazingly rigid to have these 4 votes on either side. And in a way, it's kind of like, if you think about what could a President Obama do with the court, it doesn't have anything to do with who he would appoint so much as who he's replacing.
Yeah.
If you replace one of Souter, Breyer, Ginsburg, Stevens, the best you can do is the same. If you replace one of Scalia, Roberts, Alito, Thomas, you'd switch the math, and if you replace Kennedy, you have some variability, and that's really all that matters. That seems I don't know. And neither of us probably have the history to know if there's a kind of comparable situation, but that's the way it looks to me. It looks kind of an ugly. Basically, you got a lot of power in the hands of one guy.
Yeah, one guy who often seems a little daft.
And probably possibly a little bit subject to flattery. You sometimes, he's a guy who get played. I'll tell you, if I were the president, and I've always believed this, what I would most want to put on the court is somebody who actually understands interpersonal politics. I'd put a politician on the court. I'd put somebody like Justice Brennan on the court, that's all they're thinking about is I need 5 votes, not the kind of Breyer-esque academic, what does the Constitution call on us to do kind of person.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I was struck by Jeff Rosen's analysis, which was similar to yours in that it sort of emphasized the central importance of Justice Kennedy, but it was also talking about how Justice Roberts has tried to encourage plurality opinions, has tried to encourage, build a consensus, and also by focusing, for example, on a lot of business-related jurisprudence, an area that the court has neglected for a pretty long time, in part due, one suspects, to the proclivities of Supreme Court clerks, who are obviously going to be drawn to cases that raise, kind of very sexy normative questions, rather than the things that, I know that folks in the circuit courts, desperately want more guidance on. And, I think it actually is a testament to, in my view, to the relatively good judgment that Bush, shockingly enough, evinced in making his appointments to the court. I think that you have the emergence of a kind of center that just goes. So I think that those 5-4 decisions can be a little misleading in that you actually see kind of little blocks. I remember actually when Bush v. Gore was handed down. I mean there was the belief that is this going to be 5-4? It could be 7-2 in some way. You had you had some maneuvering, but I wonder about that, and I feel like I'm not a close enough court watcher to really say, but I'm optimistic that, kind of the court is moving in a kind of, or moving back towards a kind of, healthy minimalism going forward, and that, either a president McCain or Obama would, hopefully continue in that direction. Although I do wonder the dynamics with the McCain presidency would be thorny because they're, that's actually another kind of broader question that's of interest to me. I mean, the size of a majority and how that's going to shape the political landscape more broadly. For example, if Obama won with a very, very large majority, if he had 60 seats in the Senate, etc. I mean, how is that going to shape the landscape in terms of foreign policy as well as, kind of the kind of people that he'd be allowed to appoint? And, would, McCain have room to maneuver, assuming that kind of he wouldn't get an expanded Republican majority.
Right.
And recently in Foreign Affairs, I'm actually in the Foreign Affairs offices right now. There was a little mini symposium with Colin Kahl, an Obama Iraq advisor, and also William Odom, a kind of conservative critic of the Iraq War, talking about when to get out. And Kahl, it was interesting how carefully couched his analysis was, and it made me think about what might happen in an Obama administration around these, because it's interesting because he was saying things that are very similar to what a kind of hawkish, or someone like myself who believes that we're going to need a U.S. presence in Iraq for some time. Yet he couched in this kind of interestingly partisan language and said that, oh, and by the way, Plan B is getting out, very quickly. I mean, it was like this very subtle dance because of course he doesn't want to endanger the campaign and was careful to say that his opinions are his own. But if Obama has a really big majority, for example, I mean, I think that there's going to be a lot of pressure on him, and if he has a smaller one, I imagine he would be pleased in that there would be more restraint in terms of what kind of things to expect from him, whether it's on the court, whether it's on domestic policy,
right.
Or on foreign policy. And I wonder, kind of you've been around, for a while, and you were kind of taking part very actively in a lot of these debates, during the time of the Clinton administration.
Okay, I thought you were going to say Truman administration. There, I was a little worried.
Oh, hardly. I mean, you're, as far as I mean, you were like a teen.
Yes, exactly. From what I remember from my childhood in the Clinton administration. No, I mean, I think that there's too much attention. There's too much modeling on those early Clinton years of, okay, look at that and that's your model for what'll happen. All the Republicans will just join forces and try to block anything. So the key factor is how many Democrats you have. I think that's misleading for two reasons. One, I think presidents get their mandates in their first year. They don't get it from the election. Reagan, and that's like the kind of the classic example I think you would look at of a successful first year of a presidency. But Reagan didn't come. I mean, he came in with 10 Republican senators came in with him. He came in with both the electoral victory and the coattails that you would need, but he didn't really have a mandate until he started actually winning things. And then when you win things, it builds. Clinton didn't come in with those things in '92, and then there were a set of things that happened that he kind of didn't manage to get that mandate. But it wasn't just a matter of raw numbers. I mean, it was a matter of doing the sequencing right, kind of packaging things right, figuring out what you could do with those first two big the budget and tax bills, so that you could create some alliances with certain Democrats who are ready to go, and go from there. I think that the best situation for a President Obama might well be, 56, 57 Democratic senators, because in a way, if you have that situation, you're actually forced to deal with Arlen Specter,
Gordon
Senator
Smith.
Lugar, Senator Snowe. You're forced to figure something out and deal with them. And they don't, those senators did in 1993 when Bob Dole said, don't give this guy an inch. We're here to destroy him, not govern with him. They did follow Bob Dole when he said that. And there were reasons why they could. It was a way to gain the back of the majority. I mean, there were a million, raw, cold-blooded political reasons for them to do that. I don't think those calculations play the same way now. These are older senators. They're kind of at the end of their career. Their states are turning blue.
By the way,
there's Gordon Smith trying to
Obama.
suck up to Barack Obama. If you had a health care thing going on now, there's no way those guys would just hold the line. It does nothing for their historic legacy. If they're trying to get reelected, it's not going to do anything for their reelection. Pennsylvania is not the Pennsylvania that elected Rick Santorum. anymore. It's just a very different state. Oregon's a very different state. Maine's a very different state. I mean, we don't really need to go through these. I just think that actually having the incentive, and then everything you do is by definition at least somewhat bipartisan, and a little harder to sort of go after. It's a little harder to have the backlash be a purely partisan backlash. So I'm kind of there's a lot of disagreement about that, but it's a very interesting topic if you have to guess. And as I say, more will depend on the way the way that Obama, say, plays out that first year than on the raw numbers. But the raw number I would be happiest with is maybe 57 in the Senate.
Yeah, I was particularly struck by a recent Gordon Smith advertisement in which he actually cited some favorable remarks Barack Obama made about him. I mean, I think it's fairly obvious what's going on, given the political coloration of Oregon. But, I mean, it certainly does reinforce this idea that, Obama is indeed a very attractive figure. It's also interesting what you said.
It has been an amazing week. I mean, just to go from where we thought we were with the level of divisiveness that had developed in the Democratic primary, the idea that McCain was actually getting some support as a legacy out of the divisiveness of the Democratic primary, and to see that sort of evaporate so quickly. That doesn't mean McCain can figure out a campaign strategy. There's possibilities there, but the last week has been, in many ways, the sort of quietest but most amazing one of the whole cycle.
Well, there's also just, kind of an interesting question concerning, to me, kind of the key issue for me in this year is definitely foreign policy, just because, kind of I see it as kind of I have seen it in the past as the area of sharpest disagreement. I know I've been taken to task on this by some of my friends, particularly some of my more dovish friends, but I do see an emerging consensus, and I do sense that this issue is going to become less partisan, perhaps to the annoyance, of, again, a lot of doves. Doves isn't even the right term to use, perhaps, but, on Iraq. And, I was actually particularly
smart people, you could call them.
I am reluctant to say that, Mark. But, well, I would characterize smart people as people who believe that, the stability of Iraq matters for us and for the world. But it is interesting. I mean, I think that actually, you do see Obama in terms of his kind of broad pivoting. He seems comfortable doing that, perhaps because he does have such a deep connection with, his base, and he feels comfortable, doing some of these things that are going to make a lot of Republicans less averse to him and sort of less cautious, particularly those of us who are, foreign policy voters first, at least this time around.
I think the thing about foreign policy is everything. I mean, most Republicans respect the concept that of the commander in chief, and we can raise questions about that. It is about the president. So the minute you take President Bush out of the equation, it's kind of like things can realign in all kinds of ways in people's thinking about foreign policy, and I sort of feel like we don't really know yet where they're going to line up, because right now the question is, they're forced onto the ground of support the president, don't support the president, support McCain's position, don't support McCain's position. You take those things out, I sort of think anything. That's the moment for a total fresh thinking about American foreign policy. And Lugar is there, Hagel is there. I mean, whatever role that he'll wind up playing. There are people already willing to be in that sort of middle space of just like clearing your head, thinking about the question of like, what's a stable and peaceful Iraq that doesn't require a huge American troop presence into the indefinite future, and then what are the other issues in the Middle East and how it relates to politics of energy and things like that. And maybe it's not my issue as much, but I also feel like there's a very specific reason why we can't quite predict where those alignments are going to go. But I think you're right to speculate that there's a potential, quite a significant new consensus heading there. And I think, I've said this before, I think the way Obama and his folks have thought about foreign policy, it's creative, it's solid, it's fascinating. And that's so rare in foreign policy, where there's always this sort of heavy sense of, here's the way it's done.
Yeah, I guess I'm not quite as favorably inclined towards it, because I mean I do, kind of whenever I see, for example, Steve Simon, I mean, kind of I think he's clearly a very smart guy, but I have to say that I think that his characterizations, they definitely don't match those of kind of a lot of people that I like and admire, including a lot of people who are in the Obama circles, and I worry that kind of partisanship, as it does on the Republican side, oftentimes is coloring their views rather more than it should. But I certainly take your point that the president is such a central figure on this stuff, and kind of their predispositions and priorities will have a big role. And that actually goes back to the earlier question that we started with about kind of authenticity. What are the real priorities? What are the real core beliefs? And I think that obviously being a relatively new figure on the political scene, we don't have an entirely clear sense of what will be the likely priorities of a President Obama, assuming that it does come to pass. But again, like even with McCain, someone who's been around for a very long time, he's also gone through pretty radical changes in his foreign policy outlook. So that'll be very exciting. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you think we should have done?
I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are a million things. I realized that you gave a wonderful talk at the New American Foundation retreat, and I picked that moment to go and check out of my room and so forth. So I forgot. I was thinking that I needed to like reprise it because it's all anyone's been talking about. So maybe the next Blogging Heads you will reprise your talk, and then I'll respond to whatever parts that I can understand.
It's interesting. I really, I definitely have an interest in the horse race and partisan politics, but it's definitely...
It doesn't get your juices going.
I'm sorry?
It doesn't quite get your juices going the way bigger, cosmic.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like there are a lot of deep structural questions. I feel like the things that make me a conservative are not actually the things that we generally talk about in the context of partisan politics.
That's true, because that's why I've never understood why you're a conservative.
Oh, no.
Other than David Brooks says you are, you must be. So can't argue with David Brooks.
Terrifying right winger. But thanks so much, Mark. I really appreciate it. It was great talking to you as always.
Okay, take care.
Talk to you later, Mark.
Okay, bye.